Liberal MP Terry Stevens has just announced that he will not be recontesting the next election because he will be leaving the parliament in March 2025. Now, you might remember Terry Stevens as the guy who banned me from the parliament on the most corrupt and spurious grounds imaginable. So why is Terry really leaving, and what's actually going on to turncoat Terry? And that's today on The Dr. Joe Show. Before we get into today's show, and I promise we're going to have a lot of fun, guys, please do subscribe to this channel if you're new here. The more people that subscribe, the bigger our movement becomes. Elected in 2002, so this guy's been sitting in our parliament for nearly 25 years. Terry Stevens has been a member of the Legislative Council, which is the South Australian Upper House. It's the House of Review. Now, you would think that over a political career that has spanned that long, you would find something of note, something that this guy's actually done to contribute to our state of South Australia, something to improve the lives of people. But on a Google search of Terry Stevens, no joke, the only things that come up are the scandals, the things that he's done wrong. There's no announcement of anything he's ever done. Nada, zip, zilch, like nothing. So you Google Terry Stevens and, you know, the first thing that comes up is the expenses scandal, the fact that he had a house in Adelaide, in Norwood, and he had a house in Victor Harbour, and he said he was living in the Victor Harbour house so that he could claim the country regional MP's extra expense. So they get like over $250 a night if they say they're living in Victor Harbour, but then they have to, work in the parliament. Now, none of us get this. Like, the rest of us just have to commute for work, hours sometimes on end. We don't get that special perk because we live too far away from our place of work. But, Terry Stevens was claiming thousands of dollars through this, and the ABC revealed that he was actually most likely living in Norwood at the time when he was claiming this. The second thing you get when you Google Terry Stevens is you find out he hasn't been paying land tax, apparently, on one of his properties. And the third thing you get when you Google Terry Stevens is that as president of the Legislative Council, he apparently let the F-bomb out just a few days ago. Let's watch. Now, bearing in mind that this is the guy who sits in his big chair with his officious-looking robes and his pompous voice pointing at people, telling them to take off their hats and to behave in a decorous manner after doing literally nothing to justify his fat cat salary of over $200,000 for just being a member of the LegCo, Terry Stevens showed his true colours when the Libs lost the last election. As I said at the outset, Terry sits in the upper house, the House of Legislative Review. So it's not common for the government to control both houses, and indeed to pass law, to make legislation, they have to introduce it in one house and pass it through the other. Now, the government of the day always has the majority, or they rule in a minority government with the agreement of a minor party in the Legislative Assembly, in the lower house, it's sometimes known. And indeed, the government of the day, Peter Malinauskas' Labor government has a majority there. But what they didn't have when they won the last election was they didn't get that majority in the Legislative Council. Now, Terry Stevens, as a Liberal, you would think that he's been elected by Liberal pre-selectors to represent the Liberal Party. He's been elected by Liberal voters because they want him to represent Liberal interests, which is as a good opposition to the Labor government. But Terry Stevens, he did a dodgy deal straight after the Libs lost to ensure his own money, status and power and parliamentary pension and his future. And he did that over and above the interests of the people that place their trust in him. You might be asking how he did this because he's a Liberal. Well, Labor bought him with 30 pieces of silver, or to be precise, close to $300,000 and a chauffeur-driven car, because that's the perk that you get when you get to be the president of the Legislative Council. Now, if Terry Stevens hadn't done this, it would have been much harder for Labor to pass this legislation. They would have needed not just the Labor members, who of course they're going to get because Labor binds its members, they would have needed those votes, but they would have needed the Greens and some members of the crossbench in order to pass legislation. Because Terry Stevens did this dodgy deal where he took the money and the perks and signed his soul over to Labor so that he could be president of the LegCo and sit in his big chair, because he did that deal, it meant that it was much easier for Labor to dominate the upper house. They didn't need to negotiate with the crossbench, so with people like Frank Pangallo and Sarah Game and Connie Benares and the Greens. They could just negotiate with just the Greens or just the crossbench. And so that tells you something about Terry Stevens, because he put his own interests and power and status and money over and above the needs of the people of South Australia. Terry jumped at the chance to do this deal with the Labor Party for his own interests, and he put that above any sense sense of doing what's right for the people of South Australia, or any sense of loyalty to his own party and the people that had pre-selected him and put their faith in him to represent Liberal interests in the parliament. And in fact, of course, it's Labor that's crowing when this happens. Peter Malinauskas says, of course, this gives us a much better chance to get our legislation through. He says Labor has been elected with 9 members on the Legislative Council by not taking the presidency, so by not giving it to one of their own members, it means we've got a extra vote on the floor. And the whole thing just leaves a really bad taste in your mouth, because if you recall, it was actually Labor in 2022 when the whole Terry Stevens expenses scandal blew up. Labor stood up and said, well, he shouldn't be in the parliament, he shouldn't be in the president's chair of the Legislative Council because he was president under the previous Liberal government, and they said he shouldn't be in that job because South Australians need to have confidence in him. But the minute they win the election and they need him because they want to get a Liberal vote off the floor of the parliament, so they want to neutralise that vote and they want to push their legislation through, all of that is forgotten and they offer him the president's chair. I mean, it just makes you feel gross, the dodgy deals, the dirty deals that these people do. But you might be thinking, this guy sounds like a douchebag, but most politicians are, and why do I actually care? Well, I didn't even know who Terry Stevens was until the night of the debate on the live births bill. So this was last year. Some of you guys will know. I worked with Ben Hood, and other experts worked with Ben Hood to draft a bill that said after 28 weeks, if a baby, if the mother wanted to terminate her pregnancy, she couldn't kill the baby through an injection and poison into the baby's heart. But instead, because she has to deliver that baby anyway to terminate her pregnancy, she would deliver that baby alive, and the baby could be placed in the NICU, or they could be placed, and then after that, adoption, or the mother might change her mind and raise the baby. Now, this wasn't a radical bill. This is a third trimester abortion ban. And I think 99% of people would say that this is a reasonable piece of legislation, but not for the pro-abortion Labor Party, not for pro-abortion Michelle Lenzik and the Liberal Party, not for the Greens, not for Connie Benares. There's people that are just so ideologically addicted to abortion that they can't brook any kind of measure like this that would save babies late in the third trimester and still allow the mum to end her pregnancy. They just couldn't handle it. So they just went psychotic. And on the night of the live births bill, it all became very close. And there's other episodes you can watch to see that. But I was in the parliament, in the gallery. I was watching the proceedings as they unfolded. I was there at the time of the vote. I was also leaving the gallery at times to go into the corridor, and I was let into that corridor by another MP. I spoke to MPs about how they were voting. All of that is normal within political lobbying. That's what you would expect. That goes on in Parliament all the time. In fact, some people's their very job is to be a political lobbyist, and they get paid lots of money to do it. This is part and parcel of the political process. But when we lost the live births bill by one vote, all hell broke loose because we got so close, apparently, that they just couldn't even handle that, even though they won. And 2 weeks later, this guy, Terry Stevens, gets in his chair, puts on his robes and puts on his pompous voice and bans me from the parliament. Let's watch.
Accounts have been given of the behaviour of one particular visitor seated in the President's Gallery during the division on the second reading of the bill. The members providing the accounts have identified that visitor as Dr. Joanna Howe. During the division, it was claimed that Dr. Howe was observed yelling at the Honourable Dennis Hood to discourage him from vacating the chamber in order to provide a pair for the vote. Further accounts have been provided of the behaviour members had witnessed or experienced in the corridors and adjacent areas by Dr. Howe and other visitors. Members have claimed to witness insults and threatening and intimidating tactics employed by Dr. Howe towards some members. It is entirely unacceptable for visitors to roam the corridors and other areas adjacent to the chamber unaccompanied. It is even more unacceptable that any member should feel intimidated or threatened by visitors while carrying out their free performance as a member of the council.
Now, to be clear, Turncoat Terry had given me no prior warning of this ban, but had clearly given it to the mainstream media because an ABC journalist had called me before he'd even announced the ban to ask me about my opinions and my response to the fact that I was going to be banned from the parliament. My question is, how did this ABC journalist know this before I was even notified? I'd never been given these allegations that he makes. So he says, I was apparently insulting people, intimidating people, trolling the corridors, And that apparently at the time of the vote, I was observed yelling at Dennis Hood, telling him not to pair. Now, I had a very strong opinion that Dennis Hood shouldn't be pairing, but I was as shocked as anybody that he was pairing. And I certainly didn't yell at Dennis Hood. You can actually see that definitively because all of this is recorded. And if I had been yelling, you would have been able to hear that on the microphones. And in fact, you cannot hear me at all. And no footage from the night indicates that I'm doing any of this intimidating behaviour to these MPs. And, you know, I had on my show Sarah Game, who she says they tried to convince her to speak against me and to say that I'd intimidated or bullied her. She refused to do that. So then they went to Jing Lee and she makes this extraordinary statement in the parliament where she says that somebody intimidated her and she felt under tremendous pressure, but she doesn't indicate who they are. So Terry Stevens makes all of these unsubstantiated allegations without giving me any prior warning, any opportunity to respond. So no procedural or substantive fairness. And it's all because he's a Labor puppet. It's because pro-abortion Labor MPs wanted to wreak revenge on me. So they got Terry to institute this ban on the most spurious, corrupt basis imaginable. Now, none of this happens without Peter Malinauskas knowing, because he is the Premier of the state. He governs that parliament. All of this happened with his knowledge. But there's enough distance from it for him so that there's plausible deniability. But it's just so gross how corrupt they are and how Terry allowed himself to be used. So in exercising my democratic right, I wrote to Terry Stevens in his capacity as the chair of the Legislative Council on the 8th of November, and I gave him my citizen's reply, because under the standing orders, if you have been defamed in the parliament, you're not allowed to sue for defamation because these guys are protected by parliamentary privilege, but you can ask for your citizen's reply to be read into the record so that your version of events is put in the record. And that was very important to me because this was a seriously big news story. It was covered by all of the major outlets. I'm a professor of law. It had impact on my reputation. I was asked about it at work and I had to go to meetings. All of this was extremely challenging personally and professionally. And it was all done through this secretive cabal, this witch hunt by pro-abortion MPs seeking to destroy me, with Terry Stevens being their puppet, doing this for them. Now, I wrote this citizen's reply, which clearly went through the series of events, showing the evidence. You know, I was signed into corridors by MPs. There's no evidence of me yelling. I didn't yell. The conversation with Jing Lee, I put on the record. There was a selfie taken. She'd texted me to thank me for having that conversation. So there was literally no grounds that they could point to for any of the reasons for the ban. And, you know, I would have been expecting that I would at least, at the very least, you know, I might be banned from the parliament and not able to exercise my democratic rights there, but I would at least have my right of reply read. Terry Stevens has read lots of other rights of reply in his time as president of the LegCo. So on the 25th of November, so over 2 weeks later, and I can't imagine that these guys get a lot of mail. I mean, it's not a politically contentious position, president of the LegCo, so I imagine his inbox is fairly empty. But the clerk for Terry Stevens writes, "Dear Dr. Howe, on behalf of the President of the Legislative Council, I write to acknowledge receipt of your submission for a citizen's right of reply and advise that your submission is being considered." So it's now at the time of filming, the 29th of July, so over 7 months later, and I've still not received a reply. So apparently it's still being considered. I mean, how much time does Terry Stevens need to decide whether he's going to allow me to have my reply read in the parliament? I mean, this is now insane, right? Like this is so egregious that they could do this to a person, that they could defame them, destroy them, or attempt to, and then when they exercise their democratic right to reply, they just completely cover that up and don't even respond. They just hit delete on the email, presumably. Now we hear that Terry Stevens is stepping down as president of the LegCo, and he's not going to be a Liberal member of Parliament after the next election. And he says that he made the difficult decision not to run for a fourth term, and that this decision not to renominate was mine alone. I've been humbled by the level of support I've had from my colleagues and indications that if I continued, they would be happy for me to be in that role that I'm in, which I cherish. However, I think the time has come when someone else should have an opportunity. And I'd like to take the opportunity to go on and do something else. Now, this is obviously just Cope. He's trying to salvage a really shitty situation for himself. He does not have the support of the membership. He's not going to get pre-selected. Liberal pre-selections are happening in the month of August for the next election. There was no chance in hell that Terry Stevens was going to be pre-selected as a member of the Legislative Council ticket for the Liberal Party. The grassroots were furious at so many things that he's done over the last term. From choosing to side with Labor and become their puppet to banning me. I was inundated by text messages at the time of the ban from people who just could not believe what Terry did. It was unfathomable to people that he would do that at Labor's behest. And even now that the pre-selection's taking place, so many people have reached out to say, I'm definitely not voting for Terry Stevens. No, he was told, you're not going to get the votes. We're not supporting you. You've behaved abominably. But of course, in typical dishonest style, he has to say, I was assured that they would have been happy for me to continue in that role and that the decision to not renominate was mine alone. This comment by Brendan on the Advertiser story, there was zero chance Stevens was getting a ticket on the Liberal Party. Yep, that's right, Brendan. And I mean, can you imagine someone who was actually popular, who the membership was actually going to pre-select, giving a statement like this, the decision not to renominate was mine alone. They were so happy for me to continue. This is clearly Category 1 digging from a politician who's desperate to clutch at straws to get anything to salvage the vestiges of his reputation, which has been so severely trashed by his own conduct over the time he's been in Parliament. So all of this to say, we talk a lot about the Liberal Party on this show and how it needs to find its way. It cannot be Labor light. It needs to offer an alternative. Terry Stevens, being a Conservative member of the Liberal Party, he was in the right faction. He was meant to be somebody that was standing up for the babies, standing up for integrity, standing up for truth and freedom. And all he's ever done is stand up for himself. So it is very good that he's now gone and will no longer be in the SA Parliament. And let's hope that the next round of Liberal Party pre-selections, which is happening right now, actually does result in good people getting pre-selected. And that's today on The Dr. Jo Show.